Hi, this is Brandon Helwig of UCFsports.com, and today I'm joined by Cole Manbeck of the Three Ma Kansas State podcast, part of the Kansas City Sports Network. We're going to talk about this Saturday's matchup in Manhattan, Kansas. It's the Big 12 opener for both schools, but I guess the biggest news is on the UCF, and this is going to be their first ever Big 12 conference game. Welcome, Cole.
Hey, Brandon, thanks so much for hopping on with us. Really appreciate you also doing the show with us over at Three Ma as well. We got to exchange interviews here, so it works out pretty well. Nice little partnership we got.
Yeah, I like that. I enjoyed talking with you earlier. So I guess first of all, can you just kind of talk about your background a little bit and kind of your connection with K-State? When you got started covering the program, is it did you grow up as a fan or go to school there? What's kind of your background?
Sure, yeah. So I grew up a diehard K-State fan. Grew up in a K-State family. Attended Kansas State 2005 to 2009. Went to school for journalism. Graduated with a journalism degree in 2009. Was fortunate to actually get hired by the local Manhattan newspaper right out of college and was assigned to the K-State beat. So while a lot of people have to work their way up, cover high school and some of the other sports, I was very fortunate that I was able to jump right in on K-State athletics. And it happened to be, the resurgence of Bill Snyder coming back in as the head coach and what we call Bill Snyder 2.0 when he eventually took K-State back to the top rope of being number one in the country in 2012. And it also happened to be when Frank Martin was the men's basketball coach. K-State had an insane run in the Elite Eight in 2009-10, and he took them on that run, double overtime game against Xavier. So it was a fun 4 years that I was on the beat. I left the beat, got married. Wife wanted me to kind of change career paths. I went into corporate communications, so I've been doing that ever since. But I've stayed involved with K-State, and I do Power Cat Game Day, which is the pregame radio show. This is my 8th year of doing it. It's a 2-hour radio show broadcast across all affiliates throughout Kansas before the games. And then we started this podcast called Three Ma. There's two others of us. So for those of you that are wondering what the heck is Three Ma, it's a play on words with the name EMA, Every Man a Wildcat. And there's 3 of us that co-host the show. We launched that in March of 2022. It's really grown and taken off, and we have a ton of fun with it. I think we've done like 160 shows to date, and we've just been blessed that K-State's won a Big 12 championship in football, and Jerome Tang in the basketball program took off in year 1 and went to the Elite Eight in our first year of doing the show. So, yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, so you've been around a little while. So you were there in 2010 when UCF made their first and only visit to Manhattan. It was a 17-13 K-State victory, but I think the thing that everyone remembers is that storm that was rolling in, and it kind of looked apocalyptic a little bit. What do you kind of remember? I don't know if you remember every random non-conference game from a dozen years ago, but do you remember that experience?
Unfortunately, I remember pretty much every moment, Brandon, from my growing up as a K-State fan. I can remember where I watched each game, whether I was there or not, where I was at, TV, etc. And I recall the storm approaching. We were watching those clouds come in from the press box. I was up on the top floor on the interior of the press box, not the rooftop version. And we were watching those storms come in and just knowing like, okay, this looks like it's going to be a pretty lengthy delay. And I remember the ominous, nervous feeling. I remember I don't know if it's like a whistle, like you'd hear somebody shout in the press box each time there was lightning, okay, restart the clock, 30 minutes delay. And when you're in the newspaper industry, you're sitting there like 11 a.m. kick, you're thrilled because you got plenty of time to meet deadline. And we're sitting there like, well, what are we going to be here till like 8 o'clock tonight? The clock kept getting reset. It was a very ominous storm. A lot of people still have that photo. I think you shared the video, Brandon, of what your sideline view of it was. I was safely tucked into the press box, but like you and I were talking off air earlier, I remember the students mostly staying in through that storm. Like you said, not probably the smartest thing to do. But got a cool photo out of everything there that happened. And I just remember that being a game that UCF, I apologize to UCF fans, but UCF should have won it. Probably outplayed K-State, and remember Godfrey at the quarterback position, dual threat guy for them. Being a guy that a lot of the K-State media are like, this would be a good fit for Bill Snyder's offense, who thrived with dual threat quarterbacks at the time. And just remember K-State rallying late in that game and really just felt like they stole one.
Yeah. Yeah, so one thing I posted, you mentioned that video. I almost forgot I had video of it. I was going through my archives, and that was my first smartphone, and kind of before everyone's doing video now. But I realized I had a few clips, so I did post that to Twitter earlier. And a few K-State fans were mentioning, like, they were saying, like, I almost don't even recognize the stadium. It's so different now. What are we going to see on Saturday night? Has there been a lot of expansion?
Yep.
I guess that tower has been replaced. Like, what kind of improvements have we seen to Bill Snyder Stadium?
Yeah, so for those UCF fans that made the trip in 2010 to now, it's going to look like a completely different, pretty much new stadium, probably too. Now the east side upper deck, that's still really the same, but K-State spent about $200 million in renovations since 2011 on. So really, it started the year after UCF left Manhattan. They blew up the press box. They built a new $75 million press box that, as you drive up and you walk around the stadium, a lot of it looks like a castle theme. You'll notice it kind of feels like it's a lot of limestone, especially on the north end zone and the west side of the stadium. So limestone castle look. It's very pretty architecturally. It's a huge press box. They redid the locker rooms, the whole veneer football complex. It was a $75 million project as well. Elevated the seating. So like that video that you had, Brandon, on your smartphone, like you'd be looking at something completely different, a much taller building in that area. And then they spent $50 million on another premium end zone seating area in the other end zone. So you add that up, I mean, you're talking about almost $200 million spent on the stadium, and it's changed quite a bit. You'll see a video if you get into the stadium early enough. They'll play Brooks and Dunn, Proud of This House We Built, and they'll show the stadium back when it was built in the 60s to where it is now, and it's pretty crazy.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the football team. I think last year, I mean, I guess in my eyes, I don't know about your eyes, K-State kind of came out of nowhere, in a sense, to win the Big 12. I remember early in the season, there was that game against Tulane, and that might have been before we knew about Tulane and how good they were going to end up being. Obviously, coming from the same league, UCF just came from the American, but K-State went on to win the conference. I know there were some quarterback issues with Adrian Martinez getting injured halfway through the year, but upset TCU in that title game coming into this year. So just kind of sum up, kind of how you felt about last season's championship team and kind of how parlay that into kind of what the expectations were to carry that over into the 2023 team.
So ironically, I picked K-State on the preseason show last year to win the Big 12. Like we did expect there to be a jump with the returning guys in place that they had. Now I would be lying to, but I would be lying to you, Brandon, if I thought the path to getting there was what ended up happening. And if I felt that same way after the Tulane game, because I didn't, the K-State, I was at that Tulane game. First of all, in the season opener, K-State threw for 53 yards against an FCS team in South Dakota. And they couldn't get the passing game going at all with Adrian Martinez. There were a lot of headlines and punchlines at him. Oh, look, same Nebraska quarterback came in at K-State, couldn't throw the ball. Then they dominated Missouri. It was a rainstorm type day. It was a sloppy game, but they win 40-12. And then I was at the Tulane game. They lose 17-10. They could not do anything offensively. And the fan base could not have been more frustrated and just disheartened by what happened on that day. Now, granted, like you said, we didn't know Tulane was going to be a 12-win type team and as good as they were at the time. So it was a little bit of a relief as the season continued to go that Tulane found a lot of success. But the very following week after that game, K-State goes to Norman, to Oklahoma. And Oklahoma, keep in mind, they were ranked 5th in the country at that time. They dominated teams in their non-con. And K-State fans are thinking there's no chance they'll win that game. And from the start to finish, they led. And they won that game 41-34. And then they just took off from there. It was a roller coaster ride. There were a lot of injuries. There were injuries to the quarterback. Will Howard, somebody that hadn't really shown that he could play quarterback all that well in his career to date, broke out in a game at TCU when Adrian Martinez got hurt, and Will Howard thrived, looked like a completely different player, and he went from there. Adrian Martinez returned, played a couple games, then had what was a season-ending type injury, I think fractured leg. He returned to the Sugar Bowl and played a few snaps, but Will Howard found a tremendous amount of success, and the offense actually with Will Howard at quarterback averaged 3.8 points per drive last year over 6 games. And the number one offense in all of college football last year was USC at 3.76 points per drive. So that tells you now the competition, and it wasn't over the course of the full year, but it was a 6-game sample size. The defenses he faced weren't the top defenses in the Big 12, but it shows you how good the offense was when Will Howard came onto the field. Now, they don't have Deuce Vaughn anymore, and they clearly miss him. I mean, he was an All-American running back, maybe the second best running back in school history behind Darren Sproles. So they're definitely missing some guys right now that, and they're working through some things. But yeah, it was a fun season, and like I told you, I'd be lying if I thought the path to getting the Big 12 title turned out to be what it did. Even the roller coaster ride of the Big 12 championship, you felt like it slipped away when it got to overtime. You blew an 11-point lead in the fourth quarter, and you thought you're not going to mentally overcome this, and the goal line stand. Just a wild year.
Yeah. So obviously, fast forward to the present. K-State is 2-1. Opened the season with a 45-0 shutout win against FCS Southeast Missouri. Beat Troy the next week 42-13. But I know the game that I know you're going to shake your head about it. It was the last week at Missouri. Former Big 12 rival. You lose on a walk-off 61-yard field goal. I know that was painful, but it might have been more painful when you look at the depth chart this week and just see the players that you potentially lost from that game. What's kind of been the aftermath of that Missouri game, and kind of tell us about the injury situation? You mentioned Will Howard as the quarterback. It sounds like he's highly questionable to play this weekend. Yeah,
that loss hurt more ways than one, and we didn't know how much it hurt at the time until we heard Chris Klieman's press conference. Got some calls Sunday after the game, found out from a couple sources that there were more injuries than we maybe thought, or the severity of some of the injuries were a little bit more than we initially thought at the time, didn't know. I was in Columbia. I was in the K-State fan section of those seats. It wasn't a fun mile walk back to the car with me and the guys that we were with some of those Missouri fans storming the field and everything. But I think K-State fans, they had pretty high expectations they would win that game. They felt like they had a significant coaching advantage over Eli Drinkowitz. And, the game of last year was probably misleading, 40-12. Missouri has a very talented defense, and I knew it would be a dogfight. And look, credit to their kicker. The game wasn't won or lost on that play. I mean, obviously he won it on that play with the longest kick in the history of the SEC at 61 yards, but we knew he had a chance to make that. He's 11 of 15 from 50 yards or more in his career. Dynamite kicker. UCF has an outstanding one too, we know, and Colton Boomer as well. So that'll bring back flashbacks. I know he already had a walk-off, essentially field goal too this year against Boise State. Yeah. But yeah, getting back to what you'd asked about, coming back from that game, we talked to Cooper Beebe for the podcast today. K-State's All-American offensive lineman, probably going to be a first-round pick. And the press conference yesterday, it sensed a pretty ticked off, motivated locker room coming off that Missouri game and what transpired. So I expect to see a fiery K-State team on Saturday against UCF looking to rebound. But the injuries are going to be a lot to overcome. They mounted. K-State lost their starting middle linebacker, Daniel Green. He's going to be out for the season. He played that second half of that game with a torn pectoral muscle. You feel gutted for him. He was a first-team All-Big 12 type talent, but has just not been healthy the last couple of years and hasn't been the same player. So they lose him, and they had already lost his backup to an injury, Jake Clifton, who's not going to be ready to go this week. He got injured in the opener against SEMO. He'll probably be back after the bye week. So they are going to be down to Austin Romaine, who's a true freshman linebacker out of Missouri, who was actually K-State's lowest rated recruit in the 2023 recruiting class, but is far outshined. Like he looks good, I'll tell you that. But it's a different animal, as you know, going up against Gus Malzahn's offense and what he's going to face. His eyes are going to be tested a lot with the misdirection and motion. So that's going to be something to watch for K-State defensively. And then Will Howard, obviously being pretty dinged up. He looked okay in the first couple series of that game against Missouri. And then we just started noticing him. I don't know if it was a particular hit. It's not like anything structural. It's not like knee or ligament or anything like that. It's more of a deep bruise, we believe, but he could hardly move out there in the second half, and it made K-State easier to defend. And it sounds like he's going to probably be a game time decision. What I would suspect, Brandon, is he's available in an emergency situation, but I think they'll probably turn over the reins to Avery Johnson, who is another true freshman. He's a dynamic dynamic talent. I mean,
tell us more about Avery, because I was looking at his background. He's originally from Kansas, and so he was a 4-star quarterback in this past year's recruiting class as a true freshman. So I since that was a big kind of in-state recruiting victory when you're able to, I think he had finalists of Oregon and Washington had a bunch more offers than that. Just kind of tell me more about Avery and what you expect, and just kind of how important it was to land a guy from Kansas.
It was probably the big. So first of all, it was the first time, believe it or not, in I think 17 years, K-State landed the number 1 player in the state of Kansas. You know, for whatever reason, a lot of these kids, they go south, they leave the state, they go down to Oklahoma. They've lost a lot of kids down to Oklahoma State over the years. They've lost some to Nebraska and the bordering states, even though K-State has been the dominant program in this state and has been a top 10 team in the country year in and year out, you know, for several years, going back to the 90s, and then having another run in the 2012, 11, and 2014, et cetera. You know, they've lost a lot of those kids to go out of state. They land Avery Johnson. It was a lengthy recruitment, and it was just probably the biggest recruiting win that K-State has had in more than a decade. I mean, I'd have to go back to like Arthur Brown, landing him out of the transfer portal, and Bryce Brown, the Brown brothers out of Wichita, coincidentally as well, and the impact that they had. Well, Arthur had, Bryce didn't work out at Kansas State. And so Avery Johnson, just a dynamic talent. He threw for over 4,000 yards his senior year of high school last year, and is arguably maybe the top 2 or 3 fastest player on this team currently at Kansas State. Dual threat, true dual threat. He was a top 5. I think he graded out. Some of the recruiting services had him as, I think, the number 3 dual threat quarterback in the country. Notre Dame also wanted him really bad. Florida State tried to get heavily involved. Oklahoma offered him. He had offers from almost anywhere in the country, but eventually chose K-State. And we knew for a while he was likely going to choose K-State. Really good relationship with offensive coordinator Colin Klein. So it was a gigantic recruiting win. He's a guy that arrived in spring ball, really intelligent, picks things up quickly. So being here for spring ball will help if he's the guy that has to take the field against UCF. And he's played some this year so far, you know, kind of garbage time against Troy. He looked great. And then he got, I think, 7 or 8 snaps against Missouri. They were all running plays, though. They didn't cut him loose and let him throw it.
Okay. Yeah, well, just kind of tell us a little bit more about the offense, players to watch. So we just talked about the quarterback position with Avery Johnson, the likely starter. I know K-State has kind of a really cool story at tight end. Am I right? Former walk-on. Is it Ben Sinnott?
Ben Sinnott. Yeah, Ben Sinnott.
Yeah, it's a really, really cool story. Tell me a little bit about Ben and kind of his journey.
Walk-on from Waterloo, Iowa, that actually was a hockey player growing up, and picked up football a little bit late. Chris Klieman actually told people that I know when he came into the program at K-State, when Ben Sinnott enrolled as a walk-on, he said, this guy's going to play in the NFL someday. And I was like, well, I mean, it seems hard to project. And now we're watching him, and Mel Kiper currently has him on ESPN as the number 3 draft eligible tight end heading into the 2024 NFL draft. He's a big time playmaker, physical type tight end. K-State lists him as a fullback, Brandon. I think that was true. They line him up hybrid. They'll put him in the backfield, but they'll also put him on the line. Obviously, they'll split him out wide. He's about 6'4", 245, and he can run. He's physical. He hurdles guys. Like, he'll jump over you. He's a tough player, tough nosed player. He had 78 yards against Missouri. He had a couple really impressive plays. He also had a tough drop that really hurt them in that game that I'm sure he'll tell folks he thought he should have caught the ball. There were a couple drops potentially. But he is a weapon. He was, I think, number 3 or 4 in the country last year in yards per catch among all tight ends. I think he averaged about 15, 16 yards per catch last year as a tight end. That led the Big 12. I say they list him at fullback, and I think part of that was done strategically to get him on the all-first team preseason team, because Jatavion Sanders of Texas, who's a tight end, is the preseason all-first team Big 12 tight end.
Right. So I guess when you look at the rest of the offense, are there 1 or 2 other players to watch? I understand when your offensive lineman, one of the best in the country, best in the conference, is coming back this week. Is that right?
Yeah. So first of all, they have Cooper Beebe up front, and he's probably the number 1. He's Mel Kiper and all the draft analysts' number 1 guard in the 2024 NFL draft. He's going to probably be a first-round pick. And what about Cooper Beebe? He's outstanding. This is his 5th year in the program. He could have went pro and been probably a late first, early second this last year. He chose to come back partially because he wants to put his name in the Ring of Honor at Kansas State. And he also wants to mentor his brother, Camden, who's a true freshman at K-State this year on the offensive line. Cooper Beebe's outstanding, and they flipped him out to right tackle game in and game out. So their right tackle, Carver Willis, has struggled time to time this year. And when he struggles, they just move Cooper Beebe from left guard out to right tackle. He's versatile. He's a brilliant player, and he can play anywhere on the offensive line. He's quite the weapon that they're able to utilize. The big problem for K-State up front, the huge storyline going into this year is they returned every single starter on the offensive line. All 5 starters decided to come back, and that includes a 6th-year guy at left tackle in KT Leviston, a 6th-year guy at right tackle in Christian Duffy. Hayden Gillum is entering his 6th year at center, and then you got Cooper Beebe year 5. So you have a lot of very experienced players up front, and they have started off extremely slow. Something doesn't look right, and part of that is because Christian Duffy got hurt, the right tackle. He got hurt in April just after spring ball, suffered a foot injury, and is just now getting back. He's probably going to play maybe 25 to 30 snaps for his first appearance since that injury against UCF. But he won't play the full game, and there'll probably be some rust to knock off, and they'll probably play Carver Willis, the other tackle that started there the first couple of games as well. He'll probably play some there too. So it's been a loss, but it should not. What I will say is it shouldn't have thrown the offensive line that out of whack with as many experienced guys as they've had. And they've just struggled a little bit. They haven't gotten the running game going to the expectation you'd have, and they haven't protected quite as well as you thought they would.
Right. You touched on linebacker Daniel Green. Just such a shame to see such an excellent player be lost for the season. How does that impact that defense? Can the linebacker, you said there's been another injury to the linebacker court. Can they absorb the loss? And what's kind of the prospect for that side of the ball, losing maybe their number one impact player? So
it was the deepest position linebacker was on the defense heading into this year, which is unique because last year it was probably the least deep at all the position groups. And so you felt okay going into this year. You had a lot of bodies, but you didn't anticipate within 3 games losing your top 2 middle linebackers. And Daniel Green is a 6th-year player. I just told you how many 6-year guys I have on the offensive line. It's so rare to see so many guys back for a year 5 and year 6, never transferred. He was here. He was signed by Bill Snyder, if that gives you an idea how long he's been here. And he's kind of the leader of that defense, and he's the guy that gets guys lined up as the middle linebacker, takes the calls, and gets everybody arranged and lined up appropriately. So it is a loss. Now, I will say he hasn't been 100% really probably for a couple of years and hasn't really been himself as far as on the play, flying around to the football. He's still been solid, but he's a guy that's just kind of that leader in the middle of your defense. And so it is a loss. I mean, you're going to be relying on a true freshman against a dynamic rushing attack and a dynamic offense of Gus Malzahn, who's going to look to try and exploit that with Austin Romaine, man, on the middle linebacker, because his backup is a former walk-on, and Bo Palmer at middle linebacker. And so that's going to be a concern. Austin Moore, their weak side linebacker, he's an all Big 12 type player. And then Desmond Purnell, their strong side backer, they really like him as well. So they like their other groups, the other guys at the other positions on the linebacker side, but losing Green is big. And it's a defense, Brandon, that got beat by too many big plays against Missouri. And so that'll be something to watch for in this game. They've done a really nice job minimizing big plays in the first 2 games, but when they were truly tested by a weapon like Luther Burden and Theo Weiss at Mizzou, they didn't perform very well. They gave up 7 plays of 20 or more yards last week, and we all know this is a UCF team that has 28 rushes that went for 10 or more yards so far this year. K-State's defense has only given up 5 rushes of 10 or more yards this year. So it's going to be a battle of strengths, and it'll be interesting to watch.
Yeah, I know stats of this. It's too early to really bank on statistics. UCF's the number 1 team in total offense. I think K-State is 3rd in the country in limiting teams to 50 yards per game running. So, yeah, something's got to give, but I don't know if we'll see how the stats shake out. But would you say that is the strength, though, when you look at the defense for K-State? Is it that defensive line? Is that what, now with the injury to Daniel Green, is that the strength you would say?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, the front 6, 7, they've been really solid. K-State runs a 3-3-5 scheme defensively, and they played really good football, especially against the run. And, it's hard to deny at this point. I feel like they've locked down a couple of pretty good backs. Now, their season opener, they played Southeast Missouri State. They had a first-team 2-time All-American running back, and Simo ran for, I think, -6 yards in the game. They couldn't get anything going. I don't take a ton from that. It's an FCS team still. Troy had Kamani Vidal, an all second-team Sun Belt guy at running back. He couldn't get anything really going. And so now on the year, they're at 180 yards rushing allowed, or 182 yards rushing allowed on 82 attempts. But actually, 2 of those rushes is a 46-yarder and a 36-yarder. So if you take those 2 away, they've allowed 100 yards on 80 rushes. Now that includes sacks, but they're really allowing right around like 1.2 yards per carry. If you take those 2 big plays away, it's 1.8 without them. So yeah, you're going to be talking about strength versus strength. I think that's their strength. Now, what I will say is, until last week against Missouri, the corners and the secondary had looked really good. I think K-State has a lot of faith in their 2 corners. Will Lee, who's a 6'3" corner that was offered actually by Alabama after winning the JUCO national title, and he locked down the #1 junior college player in the country in that game that was committed to Bama. He's been really good. Jacob Parrish, a true sophomore out of Olathe, he's been really good too. He had a few struggles last week. Safety play has been left a little bit to be desired so far this year, so that's an area they got to clean up.
Yeah, I know you got to run in a minute, so
I'm good.
Okay,
still got 10 minutes.
I know you got a kid to pick up.
I got 10 minutes still for you, Brandon.
Okay, I got you. So to go back to offense a little bit, Chris Klieman comes in a few years ago from North Dakota State. Colin Klein is the former Kansas State quarterback. He's now the offensive coordinator, as of last year. Just kind of tell us what we can expect offensively and what K-State likes to do. I know maybe some question marks with a new quarterback. I don't know how that will change the playbook or the play calling, but what's kind of been the bread and butter for, I guess, the Colin Klein offense these last couple of years?
It's an interesting question. It's a little hard to gauge because they had Deuce Vaughn last year. Like I said, a guy that had 4,800 career yards in 3 seasons at Kansas State and was just an absolute dynamite player in the passing game and in the running game. He had over 1,200 yards receiving in 3 years and then 3,600 plus rushing. And he was a guy that you could rely on to just pop for a big play at any point. And they don't really have that right now. They don't have that explosiveness. Keegan Johnson at wide receiver was supposed to be a guy that he entered the transfer portal from Iowa. He was a heavily sought after guy. Notre Dame, Nebraska, and Texas A&M tried to get him out of the transfer portal. K-State won the battle. He's from Nebraska originally. They landed him, and they thought he would be the best, most talented receiver they've had since 2014 and Tyler Lockett. But it has not worked out so far. He's been banged up. He's been battling leg tightness since really fall camp began. And he's only got 4 catches for 30 yards so far this year. And he didn't play in the first game. And he wasn't really seen much against Missouri. He was on the field, but only targeted once. They need him to take the lid off of defenses because he's that vertical threat. Their other receivers aren't necessarily the vertical threats. Ben Sennett is a guy that you could see Missouri started to key in on because K-State tries to go to him so much at the tight end position. And if they don't have Keegan, it's easier to defend K-State. And if they don't have Treshaun Ward in this game against UCF, they basically have a 2-back system. And I consider both of them starters because DJ Giddens last year ran for almost 600 yards and averaged 5.8 yards per carry. He's a sophomore running back now entering this year. He's got a little more than 200 yards, averaging 6 yards per carry, but he hasn't been all that effective. He had 128 yards in the opener against FCS team and hasn't rushed for much since. Treshaun Ward has about the same number of carries, and he was the Big 12 newcomer of the year. Transfer from Florida State, really talented back, and it sounds like he's doubtful, which was news to us. He played, he had 60 yards receiving and I think 40, 50 yards rushing against Missouri. He got hurt on the last play of the game against Missouri. Offensively, it looks like for K-State. So he very well might not play. So I would tell you, offensively, it's kind of hard to know how they're going to attack UCF because if Will Howard is on the field, it's going to be different than if it's Avery Johnson. Right. Will Howard, if he's out there, he's probably not going to be able to run much with the injury he's hobbled by. If Avery Johnson's out there, you can expect to see a lot of zone read, a lot of dual threat type quarterback run pass option type stuff. But in a normal Colin Klein offense, they get up to the line quicker than you saw with Bill Snyder. They'll go up tempo time to time, go no huddle. And they still are pretty balanced, really. And they'll go vertical downfield more. And they're probably a little bit more aggressive than they have been traditionally.
Hey, you mentioned Bill Snyder. With UCF, they had 3 coaches in like 6 years between Scott Frost, Josh Heupel, and now Gus Malzahn. And other than a 3-year period that I think K-State fans probably want to forget, the Ron Prince era in the middle of the 2000s. Bill Snyder was the coach that that no one else really ever knew from 1989 to 2018. So Chris Klieman obviously comes in from North Dakota State. I guess the Kansas State athletic director had actually hired him, I know, when he was at North Dakota State. So just kind of sum up this era now that he's been here a few years with Coach Klieman. Was that an expected move when he got the job a few years back? And what's kind of the reception like? I'm sure winning the Big 12 championship last year went a long way.
Oh, yeah, it absolutely did. When you think about like Chris Klieman and the hire, there were some fans that were, negative on it initially. They didn't know if he'd be able to make the jump. Obviously, a highly successful coach at North Dakota State. But a lot of people just assume that program he inherited, and it's just a freight train that rolls on no matter who the coach is, right? And so people didn't know if that was Chris Klieman or if it's more just the tradition of North Dakota State at that FCS level. He gets hired. A lot of fans were like, oh, I can't believe we just hired an FCS coach to follow the greatest coach in the history of K-State football and arguably one of the best coaches, if not the best coach ever, the greatest turnaround in college football history. And you're going to replace him with an FCS guy, right? And Chris Klieman's proved everybody wrong. And now you hear his name mentioned with a lot of jobs in the Midwest at Power 5 level year in and year out with the job that he's done at Kansas State. And what I would say about Klieman is he needed that last year. He needed that Big 12 champion. He didn't even necessarily need to win the Big 12 title, but he needed to get over that 8-win mark. They'd hit 8 wins a couple different times. And they were able to get that 9th win in the regular season. And that losing in the Big 12 championship, he would have been fine. Like, not job security or anything, but the fan base would have really embraced him. But winning it, it's taken it to another level. And now I think K-State fans really appreciate who they've got. The culture has been built here. They're recruiting at a better level than they had traditionally over the last few years. And so, yeah, there's a lot of support for Chris Klieman right now, and he's doing one heck of a job.
It's a late game on Saturday night, 7:00 Central. What do you expect the atmosphere to be like? The K-State fans, did they like these night games, or what? What are you anticipating in terms of the crowd noise and kind of what is UCF going to be walking into?
Well, they love the night games, Brandon. I'll tell you, because if you recall, so first of all, for UCF fans that are listening that are making their first trip, K-State has one of the best parking setups that you're going to find anywhere. There's a ton of parking right around the stadium, a huge tailgating scene. Like, you're going to be able to. You'll get welcomed in by K-State fans. They'll offer you a drink or anything you want. They're very welcoming, and it's a gigantic parking lot on each side. It'll be a jazzed up atmosphere, Big 12 opener. Now, there might be a little bit of somberness about the Mizzou game. That's a regional rival, and that one did sting. But I think once Saturday gets here, it'll be good. What I will tell you, Brandon, makes me a little nervous, UCF coming back in, is right now there's a chance of storms in the forecast. And that could kill the atmosphere, obviously. If there's any sort of delay or lightning or in the area, some fans don't make the trip. And also just let's hope for a 7 p.m. kick. We don't have any more delays, because that could be a really late night. I think it's like a 40% chance now. So it's been going down a little bit. So hopefully it continues to trend downward. But that's the only thing that could impact the atmosphere. Otherwise, it'll be sold out. K-State's sold out every game this year. I think they've got 9 straight sellouts since last year. So it'll be jazzed up. It'll be a good atmosphere.
Yeah. For the fans coming into Manhattan, are there some recommendations? Is there like a restaurant or some place to check out or a bar? Like, off that top of your head, what would you recommend?
So if you come in on Friday, first of all, and you're staying in Manhattan, you're fortunate to have a hotel in Manhattan or anywhere in the area. One of the cool things that happens at like Aggieville, the bar district that's right by campus, you should check out Aggieville. And if you can find a place to eat in there, go in there, or you go over to Points Avenue, kind of the downtown district. Really cool area as well. A lot of good restaurants over there. My favorite place to eat is So Long Saloon in Manhattan. It's in Aggieville, but it's a kind of a small charm restaurant. Good drinks, obviously, too. Great food, but it's not the biggest place in the world. You might have to wait a little more than an hour to get in, especially on a game day weekend, but that would be my recommendation. Taco Lucha is right next to it. A lot of people love it. If you want to just grab a drink and watch some games, Tanner's Bar and Grill in Aggieville is a great place. Tons of TVs. I'd recommend going over there for that. There's like 20 plus bars in Aggieville, which is kind of the college bar district. I'd recommend going there. But if you're there Friday night, Brandon, you go into one of those restaurants or bars in Aggieville, or in a lot of different areas of Manhattan. There's a pub crawl band that will come in, and you'll see it featured on TV sometimes. Like the K-State band, the mascot, the cheerleaders, they'll all run in. And they'll just blare the heck out of the fight song and the Wabash Cannonball, and everybody gets it's pretty cool. It's a unique college type thing. So, there's there'll be a lot of cool things to do if you come into town and just take in. It's a college town. It's a special town to me. I loved it. Everything revolves around Kansas State and Manhattan.
Last thing, I know there's a lot of question marks about this game. I know it's tough making score predictions. You may not have even thought that far ahead yet, but what are kind of your expectations for this game? I know when you asked me the question, I actually feel a little more, even though UCF doesn't have their starting quarterback either, I just think with the injury issues of K-State, I feel a little bit more positive about UCF's chances than maybe if you would have asked me a few weeks ago. So what's kind of your gut feeling about how this game is going to play out on Saturday?
Yeah, I think it's going to come down to who can take care of the football the best, honestly. K-State was a team that forced 24 turnovers last year and was number 9 in the country in turnovers forced. The year prior, they forced 18. In the Chris Klieman era, excluding the COVID season, they were second in the Big 12 with 57 turnovers forced. They've only forced 1 really this year. They forced 1 with 10 seconds left in the game against Troy. It was meaningless. So they have 2 technically, but they haven't been able to force turnovers. I'll be curious if they can force and capitalize a couple, or if UCF can turn over a true freshman quarterback and Avery Johnson. I mean, I think getting a shorter field is going to be impactful for K-State, especially if they can do something. Special teams going to be a big part of this game. Can K-State get its first big special teams play of the year? That's going to be a test as well. I think it's going to be a really, really close game. I think I picked on the pregame show that drops tomorrow on 3 on KCSN. I think I picked K-State 27-24. But to me, it's almost a coin flip game. With the injury situation, both teams playing with their backup quarterback, it's just going to be a great college football game.
Yeah, well, I enjoyed it. I appreciate you kind of dropping some K-State knowledge, Cole. I've had a blast talking with you over these last 35, 40 minutes. Thanks for the primer. And I guess I'll see you in the press box, I guess, on Saturday.
So I actually sit in the stands, Brandon, with my family. But I might, if you're walking around the parking lot on Saturday, find me. I'll send you my message or give you my number, and we'll find each other.
Well, I'll definitely check you out and find you on Saturday. Thank you very much, Cole.
All right, safe travels to Manhattan, Brandon. Appreciate you having me on.
Thanks. Take care.